Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and I am going to tell you right out of the gate, this is probably going to be a short one. Now, I've said that before, ended up still going like an hour. I'm planning at this point, probably going to be about 30 minutes, and I'm going to tell you why. So maybe just this whole preface will add like 10 minutes, and I'll get 40 minutes out of it, right? So I have been on the go the past couple of days. So I had a lot of best laid plans. So I'll explain. I mentioned last week on the podcast, I'd be doing some traveling, and it's for this work thing. It's really kind of a pseudo consultancy kind of thing that happens in my industry. And, you know, you go to another location and you kind of go through what they're doing well. It's a site visit kind of thing, and you're talking to your peers and trying to determine if the things that they're working on are good, bad, indifferent, whatever. Taking your own expertise from, you know, what you're doing and how it applies. It's kind of like a peer-to-peer kind of thing, right? And I live in northeast Massachusetts. So not quite like North Shore, but I'm Merrimack Valley, so definitely northeast Mass. And my location that I was going to was down in Stamford, Connecticut. So yes, I grew up in Connecticut, so I knew the road, I knew the travel, but it was much longer than it needed to be. It was, you know, afternoon that I'm getting down there, hit some traffic, just really long and exhausting. And of course, with something like this, there's usually a first night kind of welcome. It's a tour of the facility, then you go out for dinner. All these things are wonderful. So wonderful people. And I was part of a group with, you know, two other people who are from other locations as well. And that's meant to give multiple perspectives. All of it wonderful, great. But you might not be able to tell from the podcast, me getting out of here and just, you know, rolling, hit and play, talking. I'm not super duper sociable normally. And, you know, being sober for as long as I have, like that was oftentimes a little bit of social lubricant, if you will, for me. So I have to be very, very professional. I'm there to work, but you know, you would typically have like a beer that first night, maybe a couple of beers, and really across the room, like one person was like tempted to go ahead and get a glass of wine. Turns out no one else was getting a glass of wine. So they were kind of like, okay, fine, never mind. So we all had water. Fabulous dinner and all that. But by the time I ended up getting back to the hotel room, it was like 8:15, 8:20, whatever it is. And I had been on the road since earlier in the day. So I wanted to make sure I could go get to the hotel, get showered, get changed, going from super casual travel clothes into something that's like a business casual. And yeah, so go. And then the session runs all throughout the day. So let's see, I think we got there around 7:15. And then from about 7:50 on, it's just a successive meetings, basically back to back, 10-minute break here, there, lunch break, right back into meetings, and run through about, I got on the road around 2:40, something like that. And then the drive back, which I'd made it pretty much almost home before I hit significant traffic. I hit some New York traffic. But then I ended up getting about 2-3 miles from my exit, and it was a parking lot. So there's all that. So you can say, okay, well, didn't you plan accordingly? So I said, best laid plans. I planned on recording over the weekend. My son had another basketball tournament, which is a wonderful thing. No complaints there. But I've been also working on fitness. So I want to make sure I get a workout in, and we go to the games, and then just, you know, family time, all that kind of stuff, and just chores that need to happen, just life stuff. So I didn't record over the weekend, but I brought all of my recording equipment because I really thought that I was going to record last night. Now, as I'm recording this, it's not that much later than it was yesterday when I got back to the hotel, But I got back to the hotel, lie down on the bed, and was just like, I could fall asleep right this second. Frankly, I could fall asleep right now. But yeah, go, go, go. And then it's one of the busiest weeks for me at work. So starting, back in tomorrow, I'm going to be go, go, go through Friday with a number of significant deadlines that I need to hit. So yeah, I don't have the video posted, but I do record all the video, and I'm looking at my face right now, and I'm in seemingly good spirits. I think part of it is that I love talking to you, the listeners of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. But I am exhausted. I'm exhausted as a husband, as a father, as an employee, as a consultant, just across the board. Gosh, as an American, as a man, as a middle-aged Gen X man, I am tired. I don't know where the Southern accent came from. It just happens sometimes. So that's why I'm kind of going to be in and out tonight with this particular episode. Wanted to have something to drop for all of you because you keep coming back. I keep coming back. Really simple. Don't really have any emails to read. Let's see if anything new came over. No, not really. So by all means, I always say it. Anything you think of, send me an email. Happy to talk about it on the show. So yeah, I'm tired. And so here's the thing. So I have been tracking my fitness. And again, I haven't posted it. That was another weekend project, trying to get all this stuff edited. I track every single day the workouts that I do. And I mention the days that are my off days because that's just part of the journey, right? Well, I also thought that I was going to get a workout in at the hotel. I'm just going to say the hotel that I went to. So 3 of us were staying there and we went in separate vehicles. One person didn't have a car, doesn't drive, and was basically driven to the location, to the hotel. And I'm not going to mention the hotel's name, but, so like the lead on this particular project was basically then their chauffeur kind of thing, just getting them to and fro the different places. And I had my own vehicle. But this place, which apparently had like some major stuff going on, like also in the city itself, I saw maybe 2 other guests the entire time. The place was very, very clean. It kind of positions itself as being luxury tier. It was gorgeous to look at. Beautiful lobby, like absolutely beautiful and spacious. But yeah, it was dead. And I saw like 2 employees, like the same person working the front desk, I swear, every shift. And I saw one young lady directing someone and then like went off into the back and was gone. And I saw one maintenance gentleman later in the evening. And that was about it. The rooms were okay, nothing spectacular. I normally sleep like a rock in hotel beds. I love hotel stays, honestly. Didn't sleep great. So that's another thing. I was just kind of like tossing and turning and like waking up. I'm sure part of it was like the stress of what the day was going to hold and thinking about all the other things, including, my actual job. Yeah. So I know I even said to my wife as I was heading down to record, said, I am whiny. I'm a whiny little baby right now, and I need to cut the shit. So here I am cutting the shit. But I also didn't have a topic I felt good about. And we're just shooting the breeze. We had, dinner together. Nothing really spectacular. I'll be honest. We ordered Panera. But my daughter is out with her boyfriend. Ugh. Teenage boys. I fucking hate them. Except for my own. I love my own teenage boys. They're wonderful. And my youngest is out with the boys. They went to this like amusement place, and I guess they're headed to the movies or at the movies now. They're watching the new Godzilla movie. I guess it's Godzilla, Kong, whatever. Just the boys out doing stupid boy shit. So yeah, I mean, we didn't go out to a luxury dinner in part because, hey, I got to record and I'm also too tired to go out to another dinner. Went out to dinner last night. That was exhausting in and of itself. So we started just chatting and she brought up some really cool business ideas and things that we were talking about. But like, and I don't have a great topic, so I can just go down there and I can spitball. And she goes, I kind of have a topic kind of maybe that I'd like to share with you. I'm like, okay, lay it on me because I am open. That's where I'm always, when I give you the information of how to contact me, I'm open to just about anything if it makes sense and I can, work it within, the framework of a Gen X podcast. Like I said, I'm probably going to move it more into just a general pop culture, but for now, it's a Gen X podcast. It'll always will be because I'm the host, but she goes, I saw an interesting interview with John Bon Jovi. And I said, huh? Tell me more. And she said, I never understood why people would think we wanted to be like AC/DC. Now, I'm paraphrasing here. AC/DC's great, but we decided on the image, the look, the sound, because we wanted women. And it just struck me how very matter-of-fact he was about that, but how very true it is when it comes to musical fandoms. Now, I certainly believe that AC/DC in 2024 crosses against multiple demographics, not just generationally. I think they have a much wider spread than they did when I was a kid. And I'd mentioned on the podcast before, I was into a lot of pop. I'd listen to classical rock with my parents, but then like R&B and funk with my parents. And then, like everyone else, it was like Prince, Michael Jackson. I've mentioned many times my love of Miami Sound Machine and early hip hop, those kind of things. But in 80, let's see, I started middle school in 85. Yeah, I think that checks out. Yeah, I think so. 85 or 86, something like that. And I remember there was this distinct difference in appearance, aesthetic, if you will, within fandoms. And your AC/DC kids were also like your Metallica Kill 'Em All kids, And I liked hard rock, and I eventually started getting into, the hairband stuff before I even touched thrash. But there was this very distinct kind of divide. And music's had these divides. Punk and metal would have some overlap. Usually they would claim this kind of middle ground with like a Motorhead kind of thing. But really the point of this is fandoms. And the boomers really kicked off like the whole fandom phenomenon. But I ended up finding this little bit, this little nugget that's existed in multiple websites. And they're all kind of referencing the same thing. Or all the people who have blogs, just go ahead and use Wikipedia. Hey, guilty as charged. Use Wikipedia all the time. But the first real serious fandom was from like the 1880s or something like that. Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes apparently was really a big hit with young women of that era. And when Holmes had been killed off, I forget which book, forgive me, apparently there were like protests against like the publishers and like, let's see. So that's what? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, right? I guess there were literally these protests. Yeah, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, right? Arthur Conan Doyle. Why do I call him Sir? Was he not a Sir? Yeah, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Absolutely. But I think it was like 1890, 93, I think. And they would do like reenactments. And I guess because they thought Holmes was dead, they started sending in fan fiction. Like, think about this. This is the 1880s, 1890s, and you have young women doing fan fiction to write the next chapters in the Sherlock Holmes story because the author had killed off your main character. I think that's really interesting and fascinating that it's gone back that far. So then, let's fast forward. You have Elvis Presley. Elvis becomes this huge phenomenon. But I can't imagine, and I see no evidence to the contrary, that, primarily young women really latching on, but the fans, if you will, of Elvis, or even a Buddy Holly or a Richie Valens, a lot of the times it was teenage girls that were the fans. And there weren't like these, cosplay is really the only way that I can describe it. There wasn't necessarily a distinct aesthetic difference between these different fandoms. It was just teenage girls looking like teenage girls, acting like teenage girls who liked all of these heartthrobs, all these early rock and rollers. And that even extends into when Beatlemania happened. So think about that whole first wave of British music. Your Beatles, your Stones, your Kinks, your The Who. I'm sure there's a few others that I'm missing. And again, they were all drawing on essentially the same demographic. So that's when you start to have this like split. Because then as the music was beginning to develop and evolve and progress, you get this whole, are you Beatles or are you Stones? Now, I want to make sure it's understood. It wasn't just teenage girls who were listening to these bands. I mean, not at all. They were creating music for young people. And one of the quotes that I read was talking about how fascinating the Beatles in particular were because of their age group. Like everyone else, they started doing covers, but then they began writing their own music really before just about anyone else and doing it competently and really starting to develop their own sound, their own hits, their own signature. Some would say that the Beatles actually gave a couple of throwaway like riffs and melodies to the Rolling Stones and did so apparently in real time where Mick and Keith had like this early framework idea for a song and Paul and John went off in a corner and just boom, banged out a song and said, here you go. And Mick and Keith were like, you just did right now? You just, what? Because they didn't have the confidence in their songwriting. But again, this is about fandom, not the bands. And it just kind of splits from there. You see that first kind of break. Beatles or Stones. You can't be a fan of both, or there always has to be a preference. Or if you even go back to Quentin Tarantino and Pulp Fiction, Beatles or Elvis. Even more interesting distinction. And that's just along about a 10-year span of difference, kind of within one generation of boomers. So now you look at it, and I will have to say that Gen X is such a big component of this. I do think we started to drive the whole ownership within fandom to such an extent that had only previously, I think, existed in like sports to just about everything. This gatekeeper kind of mindset. So sports rivalries, those were going on forever, right? All your major sports started either in the late 1800s or early 1900s, particularly on a national scale. Boston and New York are always going to have rivalries, for example. That's always going to be a thing. LA, Boston. I'm just going to use Boston because it's easy for me. Montreal, Boston. Like these are long-standing, long-term rivalries. And that's fine because it's competitive in the truest sense. But does that really extend to things that aren't really competitive or maybe even shouldn't be competitive? Like Beatles or Stones? Is it really up to the music buying public to determine who the winner is? Who has the most record sales? Who sold the most concerts? Well, the Beatles have sold more records than the Stones, but just by virtue of still playing into their 80s, the Rolling Stones have virtually matched or eclipsed that just on concerts and ticket sales. So where does this whole break come in? Now, I use this example and why I think it's music becoming scenes. Music becoming scenes. And I think that a lot of it probably is somewhat coming out of the hippies. So I think that if you look at something like Woodstock, you would have people who are cheering and hooping and hollering for Arlo Guthrie or Woody Guthrie or Joan Baez or a Bob Dylan, your folk singer-songwriters, Simon and Garfunkel, but also digging Jimi Hendrix, right? Crosby, Stills, and Nash is one animal. You incorporate that piece of Neil Young, and you get something that is both similar, but it's still different. And then Neil Young and the Crazy Horse. But if you look at the fandom, you look at the hippies of the day, the summer of love, again, it was kind of a singular aesthetic. It wasn't like, oh, I'm only a Hendrix fan, and they're only going to wear headbands to emulate Jimmy. I'm sure that there are many young men who started doing the kind of page boy haircut that the Beatles did. I'm sure there was some form of that in the early stages, but it seems to me once you got into that, again, hippie era, that Vietnam era protest thing, the style was pretty much across the board. Now you could go back and say, well, what about like the beatniks and all those kind of things? But it was still, you could listen to Zeppelin, you could listen to Hendrix, but you can also listen to the folk rockers, right? And it wasn't so divided necessarily. So then you end up breaking off into, I guess, disco? I guess disco was next. So again, it was this wholesale shift and pivot, right? It was this excess of make love, not war, psychedelics, getting stoned, and then in what the disco era was starting to prepare us for yuppiedom and cocaine being the drug of choice. And it seemed like this is kind of where that first big split, because people who are of a certain age, many of them kept the whole rocker hippie aesthetic, my dad being one of them, and some leaned into the disco aesthetic, my mom being one of them. This is, I'm sure, part of the reason that they were divorced, going in very different directions as not just music and trends, but society, right? So now you have this divide in this younger demographic as far as popular music and how that informed style. Well, of course, with disco, you start to get a reaction to that. So let me make sure I have my year right here. So I'm looking up one particular band. That's what I thought. So hear me out just one second. Okay, so technically, I just want to say this. Disco technically started as a 1960s counterculture. So it started in the late 1960s, already starting to push back against rock music and the stigmatization of dance music at the time. But what I was looking up was the Sex Pistols. So the Sex Pistols were formed in 1975. So I think punk rock music and disco being huge in like New York City and your Studio 54s and all that, well, then you have this little club CBGB's, which is now starting to incorporate some elements. They didn't discard everything that was happening in disco music, which was really electronic music in a lot of ways. Yes, it was done with, real bands, but they're using synthesizers and very repetitive rhythms and all those kind of things. But those early CBGB bands that would kind of work both ways, like work within this kind of punk thing. Like I look at like Talking Heads and Blondie, they were using very much elements of some world music, African music, early hip hop, disco, but with a harder edge. So then you have this subculture building. Somewhere in the midst of all this, I want to say also in the 70s. Yeah, so 75, you have the Sex Pistols. Blondie hits the scene in, let's see. They were formed in 74. A little bit later, you have ska. So the Specials, for example, being one of the preeminent bands of the time. 1977, the Ramones, their first... What? This autocorrect thing is bizarre. I think there's something wrong with my phone. 1976 was the Ramones' first album, but the band itself was formed in 1974. So now you're starting to have this very different style. And I think we've come to get used to, like, piercings in the 90s had a huge kind of explosion, but this was happening in the 70s. And mohawks and multiple earrings and nose rings and all those things and tattoos, all really cool stuff. But it's this whole different fandom. So now you could say that you have your mainstream music listeners who are just wearing their everyday clothes and they like what they like. Then you have people who've really dedicated to this rocker aesthetic and still wearing bell bottoms well into the 80s and 90s. My dad. You have your yuppies that are happening and listening to, again, talking about things that are offshoots of disco. I mentioned the band like ABC, but then you also have groups coming through in the early 80s, like your even Hall & Oates, Men at Work, like all these little pockets of music. But even then, I don't remember consciously going, oh, that person listens to X or that person listens to Y. Now, if you saw a punk rocker in the 70s, you're going to go, that's a punk rocker, right? Absolutely. That's without a doubt. Without a doubt. But then some funny things started to happen. And that's where I mentioned when I was in middle school, the AC/DC kids and Metallica kids. So now hard rock, heavy music, and early thrash. You have, I should mention, you got like your Billy Idols in there. I mentioned Prince and Madonna and Michael Jackson, really on the pop side. Michael Jackson and Prince and Madonna were starting to impact fashion, very much so. You always knew someone who was a Madonna fan, but they would dress up more for concerts. Now, mind you, I went to a public school. There was definitely some elements of that happening in the classroom. Young ladies who would want to dress with like the lace stuff on their arms like Madonna and some of the, the hair things and the accessories. But still, I look around a typical middle school classroom and everyone's kind of wearing typical middle school clothes. Then the hair bands roll in. And the guys start growing mullets. But again, the clothing in everyday life was essentially the same. Like the hairstyles changed, but you weren't necessarily going to show up at school completely wearing like spandex because Bret Michaels from Poison is wearing spandex. But there was this other piece of the fandom, which is I listen to thrash and real hard rock. So interestingly enough, I mentioned AC/DC. Your Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, AC/DC, Metallica, probably Slayer, but oddly enough, also Kiss. Those were all kind of the same grouping of people. Kiss occupies such an interesting space in history. I'm going to do a whole episode just on Kiss one of these days. Interesting, the space they occupy. But like the Kiss fans were those kind of fans too, which is so odd because so many people have dismissed Kiss as being the relatively, either weak as musicians or songwriters compared to some of their peers in the time period, and never had these huge records. Not as platinum as you would think, only a handful, really. A lot of gold records, it's nothing to sneeze at, and huge concerts and massive intellectual property. But there was those pockets. And then there was like the hairband kids. And it was like they listened to, Motley Crue and Poison and, eventually it'd be bands like Warrant. But at that time, Guns N' Roses came out, White Lion, David Lee Roth, Van Halen, those kind of things. But then I fast forward to high school. Now you had another element really making itself known. So you have things like hip hop. So rap culture and style began to permeate the hallways of our high schools. And it wasn't just, the black kids either. And that would be oftentimes a hairstyle thing. I forget what it's called. The, flat top kind of thing. Oh gosh, there's a name for it. And I'm not talking like Kid and Play and like kid, like that really high flat top, but, like Bobby Brown had it. Grace Slick had it, if you remember Grace Slick, but that was starting to permeate. And then here's the thing. So I'm in the hallway one day, and I think it's sophomore year. And you kind of find out that you're going to have a transfer in. We're going to have a new student joining us or whatever. And I think this kid might have been from like Texas, honestly. Was it Texas? Somewhere very much south of Connecticut. And in strolls in this kid who must be 6'2", 6'3", and I'm going to say 240, and we're not talking muscle. Just a big, tall, stocky dude wearing black from head to toe. Black hair teased up with black lipstick and black eyeliner and black nail polish and black boots and a long black leather jacket. And we had in our midst, in our very presence, a true goth. Who are your favorite bands? The Cure and Bauhaus and Susie and the Banshees. And, I'm sure there's a bunch more. Never really I love The Cure, don't get me wrong. I'd listen to elements of all those artists, but it was never what I latched onto at that particular time. At this point, sophomore in high school, I'm definitely listening to Poison and Warrant and Motley Crue and all that, right? And it was the first time I'm like, wow, here's a whole other element and subgenre of what was ostensibly rock music. Those are all rock bands, but they're from this completely different world that I couldn't even begin to grasp, right? And part of the reason that when my wife brought this up, she's like, it's always funny because, we have friends who are on each end of this Gen X spectrum, and that, one of her friend's older sister, all about hair bands. But like, we're talking about like my aunt as well, like bands that predated the big ones that we've come to know. So like Dokken, for example. Dokken got to the radio before many bands. They were more of a contemporary of bands like Van Halen than people realize. But like Dokken, Rat, Quiet Riot, those all came before even Crew hit it big or, Poison hit it big. But she talked about how, her friend's sister was all in the hair bands, wouldn't have thought about going to a New Kids on the Block show. Yet my high school girlfriends were equally into a Poison, Def Leppard, hugely into Def Leppard, and also New Kids on the Block, because they were cute, talented boys who could sing and dance. That was still cool. The difference is how one would dress to go see those concerts. So again, it's not permeating day-to-day life like this goth kid. Like that was the whole thing that was so curious. It wasn't just about how you dressed for a particular concert. It was when it begins to, the fandom then expands to becoming a lifestyle. That's really what I'm getting at here, where you so identify with a particular genre of music or film. That's when it all began. So, I mean, we're putting this at probably, I started high school at 88. So sophomore year, I think he maybe transferred in the second part of the year. So let's see, that would have been, 88, 89. So it could have been early 90. So bear in mind, we're about a year away from like the grunge explosion. So now you do have this very strong undercurrent of alternative music. And I'm going to use The Cure as the example of like being one of those bands that was breaking through. But I also consider that oftentimes, at least the people I'd experienced in high school, if they had like a Cure backpack or patch on their backpack, it would also have something like U2. I remember this one kid, Mike something, but he had like The Cure. He had U2. I think he might have had The Firm. Like that kind of stuff. Oh, there was something else too that I always found so curious. I think he was a Misfits kid too. But it's just really kind of interesting. But he was a kid who had a faux hawk before there was such a thing as a faux hawk. So this fandom thing, it really is fascinating, because then when grunge hits, I feel like all bets were off, because I feel that the stylings are much more similar to when you go back to the hippies and you could listen to all these different bands, but it wasn't necessarily that each of the different bands had a different look for their actual followers, right? But I feel like when grunge happened, that was like this excuse to be like anything kind of goes, and things that normally wouldn't have been worn in your day-to-day wear kind of became normalized. I don't like to necessarily use that term, but I do know at one point, and maybe this is just me. Now, mind you, I was in bands at the time. I thought I was hot shit. And I had this pair of cutoff jeans that I normally would wear any time of year, but I would wear like thermal, like, long thermals under the shorts. Like, why? With like a pair of like combat boots. So fucking stupid. But at the same time, it was like, okay, now this is lifestyle. It's not just a matter of fandom of a particular band. It's just so odd. But it gets even worse when you think about how these fandoms have then split off, and you got your Trekkies versus your Star Wars. And then occasionally you're going to have these people go, Babylon 5. And it's like, get the fuck out of here with your Babylon 5. Is it Babylon 5? Yeah, that was the one that's, hold on. Yeah, that's the one with Bruce Boxleitner, right? Babylon 5. Yeah, American Space. Yeah, that's Michael Straczynski, who has written, I think, some of the greatest Star Wars stories as well, if that's who I'm thinking of. I thought so, at least. Didn't he do a bunch of Star Wars books? Maybe not. I thought he did. Well, I could also just be stupid. Oh, no. That's right. Okay, he's a comics writer. Huh. He did Marvel. Bunch of stuff, and DC. He wrote Superman Earth 1. I heard that was excellent. Anyway, so yeah, not who I thought it was. But he created, this is Bruce Boxleitner, Michael O'Hare, Claudia Christian. It's its own little world, and bonus points because Billy Mummy was on there, which is fantastic because Billy Mummy obviously was Will Robinson from Lost in Space. I know, I'm all over the place tonight, guys. I was trying to keep this as cohesive as possible. Then I realized I'm kind of just spitballing, so my brain is going in all different directions. But yeah, you got your Star Trek, your Star Wars, your occasional Babylon 5. You definitely have your Josh Whedon Firefly era of like what is the greatest TV series in the fandom. And now Star Wars has all these TV shows, but that Trekkie divide. But it also goes back musically. You got your Zeppelins or your Black Sabbaths, right? And those kind of fights. People start talking about like who's their favorite guitar player and who's the greatest of all time. And you got your blues based guitar players, and everyone seems to want to own something. When I say own, that's where I think this gatekeeping thing comes through. But it is so curious how fandom can turn itself into lifestyle. I mean, really none of us, and like I said, guilty as charged, should be even at all looking or emulating things that are essentially stage costumes. Like, keep that in mind. These are costumes that they're wearing to entertain. I mean, mind you, I go back to the Cure thing. Robert Smith, go back and look at young Robert Smith. I mean, holy cow, how did that guy become who he later became? And you look at him now, and he's what, in his 60s now? And he's still all eye makeup and lipstick and the big crazy hair. And yeah, I remember. So Carlos, you might be listening to this. I forget the kid's name, but I mean, he turned out to be like a pretty cool guy who was just into his music and that scene. And that's completely okay. And he was comfortable enough in his own skin to walk into Maloney High School, Meriden, Connecticut, dressed up to the nines. And that to him wasn't cosplay. That was life. And I think I told the story before that my wife's older sister, her boyfriend at the time, had invited her to go to a concert. She's like, I would love to go to a concert. What are we going to go see? He's like, we're going to go see Jane's Addiction. And she dressed like she was going, excuse me. Oh, sneeze. She dressed like she was going to go to a New Kids on the Block concert. And she was like wearing like a sweater and like a bow in her hair and like, oh, prim and proper and like all perfectly made up and a nice, belted, sweater jean combo. And her sisters immediately pounced and said, you're not wearing that. We're going to get you a black t-shirt and we're going to, put your hair down, relax, wipe some of that shit off your face. You're going to go see Jane's Addiction, and dirtied her up a little bit, Now, the thing is, she should have been able to go into a Jane's Addiction concert and not had faced any kind of scrutiny or negativity just by virtue of being this preppy girl who goes to a concert with her boyfriend. But damn well she would have been. She would have been gawked at. And God only knows what would have happened if Perry Farrell would have seen her from the stage and going, who the hell is this girl? Hey, let's all, pick on the square over here. But, that's just it's kind of a curious thing how John Bon Jovi had made that very clear that they were going for something completely different. And that's really what this all spawned from. So I don't know. Tell me what you think. Did you ever have a style? Oh, you know what? You know what also happened? Garth Brooks got really freaking popular. Really, really popular. And that mainstream country, which before that, you would have some major hit makers that hit the regular Billboard chart out of country. I'm just going to use Dolly Parton as a perfect example. A lot of crossover appeal there. And there were a few others. The Mandrell sisters, when I was a kid, that was like, huge. But Garth Brooks might as well be a rock star. We're not talking about his alter ego, Chris, whatever it is. This was actual mainstream acceptance of a huge country superstar. And that also permeated little pockets, which I also found so fascinating. I did not know that there was like a country channel like basically always in Connecticut. I do remember like AM transistor radio and like dialing through and hearing some country music. And that would be like, George Jones, Randy Travis, Kenny Rogers. Well, Kenny Rogers was a mainstream artist at that point. But I mean, he didn't necessarily have a particular style like Garth did with all those shirts and Stetson hat and all that. But yeah, you saw some little pockets of those country fans as well. I think it's just a matter of finding ways to identify, I guess, your tribe, if you will. And I guess part of that is what being young is about, and finding the people that you have some common interests with. And sometimes the easiest way to know is by these superficial things, which is the outside aesthetic. Hey, he's dressed like a country boy. I bet he likes country music. Then you go up to that kid and he's like, no, Wu-Tang Forever. You just never know. But yeah, that's what this episode is. It's about fandom and fashion and how they were all kind of rolled up and how we get broken up into these different things. And with this kind of stuff, it's self-identifying. It really is. It's self-identifying into a particular group. I would never recommend that to my kids, being like, do you really want to just say specifically, I'm X, I'm Y, I'm Z? No, probably not. Just be yourself. Listen to what you want to. And, yeah, you don't need to put it on a billboard, in the billboard meaning your body and saying, hey, here it is. But at the same time, like I said, that's how some friendships have been formed. I mean, I remember, hey, I dated a girl for a number of years and we met in high school. And part of it was because I had a bunch of different Converse sneakers that she noticed. He's got a different color pair of Converse sneakers every other day. It was like this weird little collection I had. I just liked the cons. So did she. And that just started us chatting. Simple stuff like that. I think this person is someone that I might identify with. So in that regard, I think it's kind of a cool thing, as long as you don't allow yourself to be pigeonholed. And God forbid, and I say this with all the love in the world, I don't think you should be gatekeeping at our age. And I do know there's some people who still do. And it's like the whole nostalgia train will start rolling, and then it's like claiming ownership of things. And that's when we get into these stupid little spats across generations of, oh yeah, well, when I was your age, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think about it all the time where I sense this. You can sense it sometimes in people's facial expressions where they are perceiving something that's maybe not there, right? And this happened, gosh, probably a couple years ago now. And I went into, I don't know, it was probably a Starbucks. And I don't really frequent Starbucks very often. But there was a young lady and she was all pierced and all this multiple hair. And I know I had this kind of bemused grin on my face. And she probably took that as I was just internally in my head, kind of like taking the piss out of her and almost maybe thinking I was mocking her or just judging her, when really I was like kind of thinking to myself, yeah, you probably think you're so fucking cool, as though you're doing something so unique and that old men like me wouldn't understand. And I'm like, yeah, I had hair color like yours, and I have tattoos now, and I had a ton of piercings in my face. I totally get it, and I'm not really judging you, but I would judge you if you started being like, oh, you wouldn't understand. Oh, why are you looking at me like that? Not that anyone would, but I do think it's kind of hilarious how many young people are like, oh, you wouldn't understand, when I'm looking right at them going, no, I've been you. I even look at, with my kids. No, I've been there. I don't have the same other societal pressures of like social media and those kind of things. But yeah, it's just so funny. It really is. Or when people go, and when I say people, you just see it on social media of, young people, quote unquote, discovering, I just discovered this new band. Have you ever heard of Soundgarden? And it's like, Yeah. By the way, my daughter is listening to a lot of new metal recently, which I find absolutely hysterical. But it's only because she's coming to it via externalities and not from me. Cause I'll admit, like, think about how we started, at least for me, like, Run DMC into like Anthrax with like, I'm the Man and like Bring the Noise, this rock rap combo. And then of course a group like Rage Against the Machine breaks onto the scene. Well, even before that, like I always said that, Epic Faith No More is my least favorite Faith No More song, but Faith No More, even with Chuck Mosley, did the rap rock thing. So I've always listened to some of those bands, or at least some of those songs, and she's like, "Yeah, it's okay, it's okay." But now she's come to it on her own, and she's like, "Yeah, I have been listening to a lot of that." So to know that my daughter is like familiar more and more with like Korn's catalog, I think is hilarious. But at the same time, I don't know. It's good to see her come to rock music. Again, I'm not trying to gatekeep it. I'm trying to share it. And yeah, anyway, just been rambling. This is a rambling episode. I shouldn't even call it anything as a topic. It should just be like the mad ramblings of a very tired, very overworked, stressed out middle-aged man. But that is way too long of a title. So I'm just going to say this episode, I'm going to call it Fandom. That's the name of the episode, Fandom. It's going to be the quickest write-up, too. It's going to be like a couple of lines. Hey, you know what this is about? It's about fandoms. It's about styles, aesthetics. Hope you enjoy. Tell me what you think. How do you tell me what you think? You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.